This video is brought to you by this book, written by my dear friend Goal Canestrelli, Celtic Warfare, link in the description. The Celts, the wild hordes of disorganized, frenzied, long-haired, half-naked warriors that permeate our imagination, right? Stay tuned. Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and the idea of the Celts described as a bunch of savage barbarians has become rather stereotypical. And, upon further investigation, one cannot help but notice how it functions almost too neatly as a very convenient counterpart to the well-equipped and well-organized armies of the Mediterranean, namely Greece and Rome. This is the image I'm talking about. The Celts, often exemplified as the Gauls, advance, pillage, raze, plunder, their armies lacking any cohesion, no formation, no professional understanding of the art of war. So of course, they can't compare with the professional armies of the Mediterranean cultures. Well, here's my question. As a Mediterranean, va bene, ma che cosa ci dicono le fonti? Hopefully today, I'll be able to present to you a very different picture, one born of extensive research, evaluation of archaeological data, and literary scrutiny. This misunderstanding, which is a very reductive description of the way of war of the Celts, isn't a modern myth. It's in fact an idea that was born in the ancient period itself. After all, ethnographic and classical historical narratives give us precisely the perspective of the Mediterraneans. In the words of Livy, "What are you doing, O soldiers? We are not going to fight Latins or Sabines, who, after overcome by weapons, we can turn from foes to allies. We must wield our iron against wild beasts. If we'll not have their blood, they will have ours." And so the image of a brutal savage begins to take shape. Connect that with dramatic events such as the sack of Rome and the sack of Delphi, and the concept of an ancient terror was born. Zooming out a little bit before we begin to deep dive as we usually do on this channel, I want to ask a few questions that can help us ensure a certain level of mutual academic understanding. Who were the Celts? What was their warfare like? What do we know about warlike interactions between cultures? What was the Celtic response, for instance, to the strong frontal clashes of Mediterranean tactical warfare? The best answer to the question, who were the Celts, is probably this. The Celts are an Iron Age culture which embraced an array of people, connected by a series of common traits, some cultural, some linguistic, and maybe a common religious baseline. Cisalpingol, Transalpingol, Brittonic, Caledonian, and these are just some of the people we consider to be Celtic. And even if we remain with what could be considered to be macro groups, we've got the following: Gauls, Pannonians, Galatians, Brittonic, Gauls, Celtiberians. Now, as I promised on this video, we are going to deep dive, so we will be zooming in to some of these people, look at the tribal configurations all the way down to single tribes. But for now, keep these macro groups in mind. Now, considering the bold start I had with this video, I want to also make sure that I'm not misunderstood. I'm not saying that we should never or can never use the words of classical authors, Greek and Roman voices to try and understand the Celts. After all, these are contemporary people. These are eyewitness accounts. All I'm saying is that the correct academic approach is that we shouldn't just believe or disbelieve them. We need to weigh their words with external evidence. So, since at the beginning of the video giving an example of some words that we shouldn't really trust when it comes to Mediterranean authors, I want to give you an example of something that we can instead learn about the Celts from the Romans. In our modern mind, we have the tendency to separate the Caledonians, so the Celtic people of modern-day Scotland, from the Celtic Brittonic cultures of southern Britain. It's important to say that the Romans didn't separate them. The Picts, for instance, only become a definite political entity in the late 3rd century AD, so beyond the scope of this video. And even though they most likely spoke a variety of Celtic which was different when compared to the Southern Brittonic, from a cultural perspective, they were very similar. The Romans did not perceive a difference. In fact, they tell us that the Britons in Caledonia just tended to be bigger and their hair was more commonly red than blonde. And in the occasional situations when the Romans do use a separate name for them, namely Caledoni, they use it to define what they perceive to be a regional variation of a single cultural core. And now I'd like to take a moment of your time to mention the exceptional, special sponsor that made this video possible, which is this book, Now, this book is called Celtic Warfare and was written by Goal Canestrelli. The reason why I say that this is a special sponsor is because, first of all, if you liked this video, you're gonna love this book because the entire research for this video came from this book. So honestly, number one, my strongest suggestion would be pause the video right now and get yourself a copy. The reason why I'm saying that is because the book is easy to read, packed with information, and filled with really beautiful artwork. But of course, when we talk about a book, we also want to know a little bit more about the person who wrote this, and in this case, Mr. Canestrelli doesn't just happen to be a great researcher, but also a very good friend of mine. I am really proud to be able to mention my dear friend Goal Canestrelli because he's a respected, very knowledgeable individual. He is my to-go source whenever I cannot find information on a specific topic that has to do with the classical period. You can literally go and double check right now if what I'm saying is true. That is because Goal has his own YouTube channel and you can go and check the quality, depth and professionalism of his information. Of course, link in the description below. Goal is also from Italy like me, so I'm also proud to be able to say that I helped him out a little bit for a few pages on this book when it comes to the actual translation. He asked me to double check a couple of things before going on with the publication, so I'm happy to say that there is a little bit of me in this book as well. And this is the list of all the different publications that he has to his name. So, if you're interested in Celtic Warfare, this is a must-buy. Do yourself a favor and order your copy today. When talking about the Celtic way of war, the first thing we have to establish is that we cannot generalize or talk in absolute terms. That is because Celtic warfare evolved in different areas, at different rates, and in different fashions. Let me give you an example. Even though continental Celts in the second half of the 4th century BC had already begun to dismiss the war chariot, which will eventually become completely obsolete, such item of war will endure in Brittonic realities, as insular Celtic cultures, when compared to the continental ones, were in a way frozen in time. Now, even though this is something that I've already mentioned on previous videos, I'd like to underline that it's not the only phenomenon, as a very similar ancient continuous tradition can be seen in Gaelic literature in Ireland when representing description of warriors. But in a way, this also points to the fact that the influence of other external civilizations and outside military pressure plays a pivotal role in war development. The archaeological record shows us a plurality of approaches to warfare. Now, the depth of such topic renders the task of creating a comprehensive analysis into one single video a rather arduous endeavor. That is one of the reasons why on this video specifically, we're not going to cover every single aspect of Celtic warfare. We won't talk about metallurgy, we won't talk about weapons, but we will focus on their general way of war, what we are told from classical sources, and most importantly, their weapons, armors, and shield development. Now, if you find this topic to be interesting and you would like me to make a second episode entirely dedicated to Celtic weapons, such as ranged weapons, polearms, swords and the like, please let me know in the comments below. For our analysis to be considered germane, chronological and geographical variations need to be taken into consideration. Now, between the 5th century BC and the 1st century AD, Celtic warfare culture had experienced several stages of evolution. Part of this was undoubtedly driven through the contact with Mediterranean civilizations, but also Etruscans, Scythians, and others. General strategy, battlefield tactics, weapons and armor design, metallurgical developments, the shift from bronze to iron, all of this needs to be visualized as a flux, a vortex of time. Celtic warfare can only be understood when put in direct relation to its society. A thorough examination of the material culture and an extensive data analysis of physical evidence through archaeology serve as a sort of founding platform. Now, when talking war culture specifically, this physical evidence comes in the form of grave goods and funerary art. Burial customs in the Celtic world, however, were not uniform, as localized groups had their own beliefs and distinct artistic representations. This can be somewhat of a stumbling block when trying to focus too much on the material evidence and the archaeological aspect of our journey. Thus, on this video, I'll encourage a less linear approach, strengthening any archaeological find, particularly those related to ceremonial burial, with literary, statuary, and in general, iconographic evidence. This will help us determine how technological development spreads in non-unified civilizations. I'd like to now discuss a couple of myths that I believe need addressing. The idea that they fought naked and the origins of their name, Celts. First of all, this idea that all the Celts of all the tribes everywhere fought naked is wrong. Polybius, describing the Battle of Telamon, tells us that it was the habit of the Gaesatae to enter the battle naked. The Insumbres and Boii wore their trousers and light cloaks, but the Gaesatae had discarded these garments, owing to their proud confidence in themselves, and stood naked, with nothing but their arms in front of the whole army. Diodorus is also talking about the Gaesatae when he tells us, some individuals among the Celts are satisfied with the armor which Nature had given them and go into battle naked, and perhaps their presence might be acknowledged even among the ranks of Hannibal's army, whose bulk was especially composed of mercenaries and experienced fighters. The Gaesatae are a very unique subgroup. They are a specific warrior caste, and what sets them aside, as we can read from other fighters and mercenaries, is specifically the fact that they fought naked. This very strange choice is most likely connected to some sort of ritualistic principle, but it is also important to underline that this is not only a specific characteristic of one warrior caste, not all the Celts, but also that it's a very archaic one. And even though a somewhat comparable behavior is also displayed by some Scandinavian warrior brotherhoods, it could be considered to be some sort of archetype of the Indo-European warrior who, with reckless disregard for peril, daunts the foe with his virile nakedness, dedicating to the gods and openly defying death. But as Celtic society grows more complex, this sort of custom disappears. Already in the 1st century BC, no more warriors fought naked, everyone was wearing as much armor as they could. At least when it comes to continental Europe. Now, when it comes to Britannia, as I was telling you, ancient customs tend to remain frozen in time because of the disconnect. So, some Celtic warriors in Britannia did continue to fight naked all the way up to the 1st century AD, but it's also important to underline that according to Julius Caesar, in the entirety of the De Bello Gallico which he wrote, he does not mention any naked warriors at all. As an interesting piece of trivia, whenever we imagine Celtic warriors painted and decorated in blue, well, first and foremost, that sort of decoration, we don't know if it was actual blue or some tint of green. We also don't know if it was body paint or actual tattoos. Whatever the case, this form of body decoration was completely gone in continental Europe. Maybe in very archaic traditions it was present, but it was completely gone, and the only place where it remains, once again, is Britannia, within the southern Brittonic Caledonian cultures. Now, when it comes to the name Celtic, I've got an article to read. Let's check it out. From history.com, 8 facts about the Celts. Now, the overall information presented on this article is actually not too bad, but at the very beginning there is something I take issue with, and it's of a linguistic nature. Let's go. The ancient Celts were a widespread group of tribes whose rich culture has been identified through burials, artifacts, and language. The difficulty of tracing Celtic history is that none of these ancient people living in Western or Central Europe would have called themselves Celts. That name came from the Greeks, who made their first contact with a barbarian people they called Keltoi in 540 BC. This is incorrect. It's actually the other way around. Let me explain. So even though it is true that the word Keltoi was created indeed by the Greeks, it's not that they created the word but we have no idea what the Celts used to call themselves. It's the other way around. The Celts use a word that kinda sounded like Keltoi, and the Greeks adapted it to their own language and created the word Keltoi. The reason why I'm saying this is because Julius Caesar himself, who, as we said many times on this video, had direct contact with the Gauls, tells us, Ipsorum lingua Celtae, nostra Galli appellantur. In their language, Celts, but we call them Gauls. What this means is that Celts is an endonym, Gauls is an exonym. For clarity, endonym definition. A name for a place or group of people that is used internally in that place or by that people as a self-designation. For instance, Nihon or Nippon used by the Japanese, rather than Japan. Japan will be the exonym. An exonym is an established non-native name for a geographical place, group of people, individual person, language or dialect, meaning that it is used only outside that particular place, group or linguistic community, such as the word Gaul or Galli. Now, whenever you begin learning about Celtic warfare, the first two words that you will come across almost immediately are the Hallstatt culture and the Latin culture. What do they mean? When we say Hallstatt, we're talking about a culture spanning from 1200 BC to 500 BC that initially was late Bronze Age but does reach the Iron Age. Now, this is to be considered a proto-Celtic culture. Instead, the Latin culture, which follows the Hallstatt culture, is an Iron Age, fully Celtic culture, which will be the main focus of both this video and in general this series. When we start looking into the early Latin culture and its warriors, one of the first things we notice is a gradual progression and emergence of an elite caste of warriors, and these warriors will be mostly part of aristocracy. Of course, we have to also imagine that at this time we are talking about more something in the lines of war bands than a full-on army in pitched battles. Not only these warriors would be training, trying to achieve and improve their martial prowess, but there was also a ritual aspect to them. But rather than just brutish force, one of the main characteristics of these kind of warriors was dynamism in combat. And we see that this specific characteristic continues in time even as warriors change within the Celtic world. And this will be reflected in the sort of body armor that they will design. Although body armor specifically is such a deep topic that I will cover it on the next episode. Today we're talking helmets though, so keep watching. As Celtic culture solidifies and society becomes more complex, one of the first things we see is an opening of the military warrior caste onto the low-ranking classes. This is also reflected in weapons and armor, as we will see in a minute. So what happens with helmets? Well, here I've got a bronze Roman Montefortino helmet. Now what's interesting about this helmet is that even though from the perspective of Italian scholars this is called, as I said, Montefortino, from the perspective of French scholars this will be called Celto-Italic. Now regardless of the nomenclature, one thing that we know for sure is that the Romans, even though they adopted this, they didn't make it. So who made it? Well, as far as we understand, even though the Celts absolutely loved this design and it will become the typical Celtic helmet, and it was born from a merging between the Etruscan and the Celtic cultures. The Romans probably having copied it from the Etruscans. These helmets were produced both in bronze and in iron, as iron becomes metallurgically available. And it is a very useful design, which is one of the reasons why the Romans will eventually mass produce it. Now when we look at Hallstatt culture, for what we can see because it's very ancient, we know that helmets like these were extremely rare. But as we enter Latin culture and more low-ranking warriors start to take part in more and more battles, this becomes absolutely ubiquitous in its varieties. Some Celtic varieties, particularly those of the northern Italian Celtic cultures, will have the addition of horns. The earliest models didn't have facial protection, so basically they would look like this, directly. Sometimes having more of a conical shape, which eventually will be abandoned, probably for ease of making. But as more and more people start investing more and more money into their war equipment, we see that several types of cheek plates are invented, the early ones being of the triangular shape, and then the larger ones that most likely initially were specifically made for infantry. Let's put it on. Now, of course, one of the things you would do would be to connect it here so that these don't just keep flapping around, but just to give you an idea. As I was mentioning before, as non-aristocratic Celts start to be able to join the battlefield of war, we start seeing versions of these that are clearly made more hastily, which is something that we also see happening in the Roman world as they are still using these. And we do see a decrease in manufacturing quality as we enter the first reforms that open the military to more and more people. Low-end models also having smaller backplates. Now, even though the Romans copied these specifically from the Etruscans and not from the Celts, one type of helmet that the Romans will copy from the Celts will be the Colus Mannheim type. This one. And this is interesting because it allows us to see how Celtic warfare was not that barbaric. In fact, it could have been considered to be more advanced when it comes to some elements of armor and equipment, since the Romans copied them. And a very typical aspect of that is the Roman lorica hamata, so the mail, which, by the way, the Romans not only copied from the Celts, but didn't call hamata, they called it gallica. So if we are to be 100% fair, we have to say that it's not that the Celts were barbarians that didn't know what they were doing and the Romans were super advanced and, you know, they could produce all sorts of types of armor and weapons that were so much more sophisticated and therefore they could defeat them. The reality is that both the Celtic civilizations and the Roman civilizations were almost equally advanced when it comes to war, but the Romans were all unified under a very effective military and economic machine which allowed them to basically supply every single warrior with weapons and armor. whereas the Celts were not unified, did not have the same sort of economical backbone, and even though they were very advanced, what are you going to do with a technological development such as mail if your enemy copies it and they can supply every single soldier with it? Now, when it comes to shield, even though just like armor, I wish to speak more in depth about them on the next episode, I'd like to give you at least a preliminary introduction to the concept of what a Celtic shield looks like. Possibly borrowed by the northern Etruscan culture, the Celtic shield, which is a wooden shield with a wooden protection for the hand, is a flat shield and it's held in the center, so it's a center held bossed shield. And this is interesting because considering the fact that we are looking into 5th century, 4th century BC, it's in complete contrast with Greek shields used by the hoplite. It was not strapped to the forearm. Now, the Greeks did understand this type of shields, but we already see a sort of different split in the approach to war when it comes to defense. Shields very similar to early Celtic shields are also found in Denmark and in Scandinavian culture. Classic authors tell us that these shields used by the Celts provided excellent protection for the body, and they were made of either a single plank or 2 or 3 overlaid planks, rejoined together with a resin-based putty, protecting the Celtic warrior from the shoulder to the knee. Now, the discussion of other types of helmet, and once again the discussion of all the different kinds of armor, including the organic ones that unfortunately don't remain in the archaeological record but do show in iconography, scholarly representations and literary work. All of this is an extremely deep topic and I have to make it into a second dedicated video. But if you are interested in this, please let me know in the comments below, and if you have enjoyed this video, make sure to give me a thumbs up, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to check the link in the description below to buy this book and further deepen your understanding of Celtic warfare. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.